is at the top. Media report as I serve you as your president this year. While we'd like to be together all in one room, we are holding this community conversation using Zoom technology in order to have an open communication with the membership. This is the first time we've utilized this technology for a large group, about 100. And so I ask that you be patient as we work through this process together. Susanna is sharing her screen, so you should be able to see clearly the slides being presented. Your individual screen setup will determine how you are viewing the other participants and the speaker. For maximum viewing, I suggest you set your view to speaker view. This will only show the presenters as they speak and allow you to see more of the slides. The view options should be shown at the top right of your Zoom screens. This year started smoothly, as you know, but our world and our community have been rocked by the appearance of the pandemic. Now, across our country, there are protests, the breadth and depth of which we've not seen in over 50 years. The changes coming from these events are not yet clear. This is a pivotal year in many ways for our country and the world. This is also a pivotal year for Moss Creek. Coming off 2019, when the community was divided over the issue of the renovation of the clubhouse, it has been my goal to help bring the community back together while positioning Moss Creek to be financially sustainable long-term. We have a board with diverse views on many things and may not vote unanimously on issues, but we've been united in wanting a structure that allows us to succeed and thrive. When we set the board and committee goals in January, we knew it was going to be a tough year. The goals were ambitious, but the board decided we could get it all done. And we're on track on most things. Today, we're going to talk about two areas. First, Mike Himes, our treasurer and chair of the Finance Committee, will cover our current financial situation and the work of the Finance Committee to position us for the future. As he will describe in more depth, the Finance Committee was originally scheduled to present at the May meeting the entire financial plan for any dues, fees, expense reductions, debt, and reserve funding necessary for us to succeed in the future. As we began to experience the effects of COVID-19, and as it became apparent that there was a divergence of opinions on the adequacy of our reserve fund, the committee felt that the plan could not be correctly formulated yet. But they were able to identify the problem: our inability to count on certificate income from home sales to fully and predictably fund the reserves necessary to adequately maintain our existing assets. We were already scheduled for our triennial examination of the sufficiency of our reserves by an outside firm. It was determined that a fresh set of eyes were needed to validate our reserve numbers. A new firm has been hired and begins work next week. These results, available around August, September, will either validate the existing study and gap or point out any changes needed. So as I mentioned in my advocate letter last week, we won't have the final report from the Finance Committee until the fourth quarter. Second, as you've heard, there is a policy review group headed by Skip Leonard that has been working since last year to update our governing documents. Their report on proposed changes to the bylaws to make our committee structure more flexible and useful was presented at the May board meeting and approved by the board for submission to the members this fall for a vote. Our governing documents require an affirmative vote by the members for any changes in our bylaws. Skip will cover this topic in detail today, and there will be several opportunities for discussion and questions on these recommendations in the coming months. Skip's group also reviewed our policies and will be making recommendations for changes to those at the June meeting. John Miller is on hand today to answer any questions about projects underway within our gates, as well as where we are in dealing with COVID-19. These are important issues that we're bringing to your attention. I appreciate your willingness to take the time to fully understand them. You will have a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentations. You might want to jot down notes as you hear the speakers. Mike, will you please tell us about our financial plan for the future so far?
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. If you've read the meeting minutes from the most recent Finance Committee or board meetings, or if you've read Jenny's article in The Advocate, you should be aware that the Finance Committee and the board will be addressing the 5-year financial plan and forecast. In that plan, we will be addressing a financial gap that has occurred over the last several years and the process we'll use to address it. That's my topic for today. I'll cover the following during my presentation. First, I'll spend a few minutes to go over our basic financial model. Next, I'll talk about how large is the gap, how did it happen, and why. Then we'll talk about validating that gap. And finally, where do we go from here? So let's start with the basic financial model. We segregate our financial tracking between operating result and non-operating result. Our non-operating revenue is primarily our certificate fee income, which is generated from real estate transactions. And that money has traditionally been used to fund our reserves, with the amount left over available for capital improvement projects and paying down debt. Our operating revenue is nearly all of our other revenue. It's HOA fees, activity fees, court fees, cart fees, greens fees, gate fees, etc. And that revenue is used to fund our ongoing operations such as salary, benefits, food, liquor, fertilizer, etc. Any excess operating surplus is then also available to be used to pay down debt and for capital improvements. Over the years, that model has worked quite well for us. But changes over the years has weakened that model, and we now have a gap that we need to address. And I think Susanna is going to put a chart up there for me. Thank you. Let's look at the chart we just put on your screen. And by the way, if you're on a computer and you see a line of folks, boxes of folks down the side, you can move that to the top of your screen if you have to, if you can't see the right-hand edge of the chart. But I'm going to cover the content of it anyway. For those of you who have been around for a while, this should not be a new chart or new news. I had this chart up in my annual meeting talk in the spring of last year, and I know that Peter Asmuth spoke to it in 2017 and 2018. Let's look at the chart in some detail. The bottom yellow line is the amount of money earmarked for that year to be deposited into our reserve fund. As you can see, we deposited $650,000 per year in 2011, 12, 13, and 14, slightly less in 2010. Then we conducted a new reserve study in 2014. That's the triennial. Every 3 years we do that. It identified a need for larger deposits. Now you see it's $875,000 in 2015, $893,000 in 2016, and $910,000 in 2017. Then it was time for the triennial reserve study again, 3 years later in 2017. And again, larger reserve requirements were identified. If you look at this year's requirement, additional requirements were identified, $1,365,000 per year beginning in 2018. If you look at this year's requirement of that $1,365,000 versus the reserve deposit as recent as 2014 of $650,000, you will see an increase of $715,000 per year. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, the non-operating revenue or the certificate fees. I want to make sure we all understand our certificate fees. In 2010, our certificate fee for transfer of properties was increased to $23,000. It's important to note that we don't get the full $23,000 for every property sale. A small number of original owners have transferable certificates. Some long-held properties have partial fee refunds that were put in place years ago. And we currently do not charge certificate fees for current owners who buy a new property within Moss Creek and sell their current property in a required time frame. So it's not just as simple as multiplying the number of properties sold by $23,000 and coming up with the total certificate revenue. The top red line of this graph is our revenue from certificate sales. If you remember, we were coming out of the 2008 recession by 2011, and housing sales had picked up. The revenue climbs through 2014, as you can see, and actually, if you look at it in 2014, peaked at $1.507 million. Then if you were to draw an average line from 2014 through 2019, you see a decline in revenue. I want to call your attention to the fact that 2014 is also the year that we saw a first significant increase in reserve requirements. So since 2014, we've seen an increase in the reserve deposit requirements, and at exactly the same time, we've seen a decrease in our non-operating revenue. And we have also seen that this revenue source is not predictable. As you can see from above, the root cause of the problem is the increased amount of required annual reserve deposit. Since the definition of the gap is dependent on the accuracy of the reserve deposit, or the reserve study, I should say, we're using a new firm this year to conduct our reserve study. We've used Miller Dobson for all of our surveys going back at least as far as 2008. This year, we'll be using Club Benchmarking. We currently use Club Benchmarking to provide comparisons to other gated communities with golfing of a similar size. They have experience in working with other HOAs, managing, maintaining, and providing reserve funds for assets and amenities such as ours. It's very important that we put a fresh set of eyes on the reserve study and funding requirements. They will begin their survey this month, as Jenny indicated, and we should have the results back in time for the Finance Committee and Board to evaluate before we assemble the budget for next year and our 5-year forecast. So where do we go from here? Well, first, we need to get the results of the new reserve study back and evaluate it. The $700,000 annual gap we identified is based on the reserve deposit amounts identified in the 2017 study. If this new study validates the previous one, it also validates the gap that we have identified and I've just communicated to you. It identifies a smaller, if it identifies a smaller or larger amount of required reserve deposit, the gap will be modified up or down as appropriate. Once we have that number validated or modified, the Finance Committee will provide a recommendation to the board for adjusting dues and fees. In addition to recommending changes in dues and fees, administration and the Finance Committee are also investigating possible expense reductions accordingly to close the defined gap. The recommended plan will likely be a multi-year implementation. We also think it's important to experience a few more months of life in our COVID-19 environment to better understand the financial impact before we submit a plan. We'll have a better view of this year's financials by the time we finalize this plan. In closing, we are still a financially sound community. We meet our bills. We have a limited amount of debt. We have about $1 million in unrestricted funds in the bank, and we consistently make the recommended contribution to the reserve fund as identified in the capital reserve study to ensure that we have the money available for future repairs and replacements. However, the financial path we are on is not solid if we do not make some changes now. As I noted above, Peter Asmuth reported this in his treasurer's report in the 2017 when the second bump in requirements occurred. It has been reported each year since then. It's now time to do something about it. Nobody wants to see costs increase. I have to pay the same as you do, but it is irresponsible of us to not address it now. This concludes my presentation, and now I'd like to turn it over to Skip Lenhart.
Thanks, Mike. Over the last 18 months or so, the board has received several requests from membership to modify the functions, the membership, or the focus of some of our standing committees, or to form new committees to represent developing interests in the community. In response to that, the board established a policy review group to look at our governing documents. While we will be presenting some suggestions to the board for updates on policies at an upcoming meeting, we did present proposed bylaws changes to the board at the May meeting. After some discussion and modifications, the board decided to present those to the membership this fall in a vote. By way of background, Moss Creek currently identifies 10 standing committees in its bylaws. These are finance, and Susanna, why don't you go ahead and put that slide up. These committees are finance, audit, nominating, the Architectural Review Board, long-range planning, Water Oak, Green and Grounds, House, Bostwick Recreation, and Marketing. In addition to identifying the committees, the bylaws further goes on to specify various membership requirements for each of the committees and functions of the committees. Because of the fact that any change in the bylaws requires a membership vote, there have in fact been very few, if any, changes made to the functioning of any of these committees over the years. The committee structure has, in our opinion, therefore become rigid and inflexible, regardless of changing circumstances. One of the results has been that recent boards have responded by appointing task forces, subcommittees, and so on. And this has led to a great deal of energy and time spent to ensure proper communication and to try to reduce duplicate efforts. Our proposal identifies 5 permanent standing committees whose functions are central to the operation of Moss Creek Owners Association and whose roles, membership, focus should not be modified without a membership vote. These are finance, audit, nominating, the ARB, and strategic planning. The other 5 committees' functions will continue, and their duties, membership, mission will be specified through policy statements. This will allow future boards from time to time to make modifications to respond to changing circumstances. Again, we will be presenting our recommendations on some policy changes at the June meeting, as Jenny said. But this is the basis of our suggestions at this time. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Mike and Skip. We will entertain questions at this time. If you wish to ask a question, go to your participant list, and at the bottom, you'll see a raise your hand icon. Click on that, and this will show Susanna that you have a question. She will unmute you one at a time and call on you for your question. Please state your name and address, as we always do, before asking your question. Susanna, please let us know who's got a question. I know y'all have questions.
No, I do have a question from Mindy Weaver. I see she has her hand raised. Mindy, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, I am. Thank you. This is a kind of a question for Mike, and I guess for the entire board. If members have suggestions for ways to potentially save costs in Moss Creek, would the board or would the Finance Committee welcome those suggestions and possibly consider them for discussion?
Hi, Mindy. Yeah, thanks for the question. This is Mike. I've gotten 2 emails already today from 2 separate members that have an opinion on revenue generation. And we do consider that. I guess I want to assure you that the Finance Committee has been digging into this pretty deeply for several months already in working sessions, and we're looking at quite some number of different opportunities for different levers to pull. And I don't expect it to be 1 or 2 levers that we pull. It's going to be multiple. And to your point, I think you mentioned expense savings in particular. Certainly send those to me. I would ask you, Susanna, I'm going to assume that you would like to be copied on that type of thing as well. I don't know if you want somebody from administration, but even if you don't copy them, I typically will run those over to Susanna or John to make sure that they know as well. But yeah, I welcome the input.
Thank you.
I see that Bob and Karen, I'm sorry, I can't see your last names, have a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Bob and Karen via 40109 Saw Timber. Mike, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate that. Just have a question, someone who's relatively new to Moss Creek. Could you explain exactly what the reserve requirement is, what it's used for, how it's calculated, and why the 2018 and 2019 numbers are approximately 50% higher than 2017? And then I guess related to that, your thoughts on where we'd be from a financial deficit standpoint had the clubhouse proposal passed as was originally proposed. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Let me start with the reserve funding, and I'm going to talk generally about that, and then I'll try to circle back on the increases and what was driving that, and then I'll get to the clubhouse issue. So first of all, the reserve fund is an amount of money that we set aside. We restrict the use of it. It's in the bank. It is money that is set aside for replacement of assets as they end their useful life. That can be the security vehicles, the tables and chairs in the clubhouse, the carpet in the clubhouse, HVAC equipment, some of our maintenance equipment. Most of our maintenance equipment we purchase and turn over the lease every 3, or trade them in for new every 3 years, and that's not covered under the reserve fund. But there are some items that are longer duration items that are included in that. It would be maybe a roof for a building, or so essentially it's our capital assets, the putting aside the money to replace them when they end their useful and depreciable life. The reserve study that's done is done by experts that come in and do this, and they analyze the remaining useful life of the assets and how much money needs to be considered year by year by year over quite some number of years. And then based upon that, an amount of money is recommended to be deposited so that you don't have surprises. Let's suppose you had $4 million of capital replacements. That would be a huge number. But let's suppose you have $4 million that hit you in a year. You don't want to have to say, well, where can we find the $4 million? You stockpile that ahead and it becomes a rolling number. So that's in general what the reserve fund is for, and the reserve company that comes in does that analysis. So when you look back over the age of that chart, inflation has an effect on that. When you look at 10 years of inflation, of how much does it cost to replace a vehicle or a tractor or a roof or whatever, that's an impact. But also, John and his staff have done really a more thorough job than what had been done in previous years of including items in the reserve fund with more detail than what had been done prior to 2014. And I'll give you an example that I'm familiar with is our roads. And this was a big one. This was a big one that hit us in 2017 and is primarily responsible, not wholly, but primarily responsible for the big jump that you see from 14 to 17. That reserve study had always earmarked an amount of money to be set aside every year for road replacement, if you will, repair replacement of our roads. These roads in here are private. The county doesn't maintain these, we do. And that's done out of our reserve fund. Well, John and his staff went out prior to the 2017 and said, you know, we really don't have, we've never really gotten a cost estimate on how much that's going to cost to replace those roads. And the time's going to be coming up here pretty soon when we're going to have to do that. Let's see what the cost really is. And they got some live estimates on it, what it would cost. And it was significantly more than what was represented and being set aside previously. That's an example. So part of the jump, I would say, is that our administrative staff, along with the company doing the reserve study, have done a more thorough job of identifying those items that need to be put in there and the real cost of them. And the second thing is, you're looking at 10 years of inflation too. That number is going to go up. So hopefully I've answered your question on that. Regarding the clubhouse, well, obviously, the clubhouse was voted down last year, and so that's not a factor at this point. How would that have an impact on this? The clubhouse and its cost was funded by the proposed separate assessment, and that would have covered that. Would that have taken us out of this problem completely? No, it wouldn't have, but it would have been the assessment likely by doing the clubhouse and doing the renovation on that, we would have been looking for less of the $700,000 that we are now. By an amount, I don't know. We didn't crank those numbers in that manner back then. But yeah, would it have an impact? Yeah. The number would probably be less that we're looking at right now, but it would still be significant.
Thank you very much.
Let's see, next I have Mr. Vivalides has a question. If you unmute yourself.
Thanks, Susanna. First, I just want to say to the board that I really appreciate all the work you've been doing, and the presentations have been excellent. I want you to know that it's greatly appreciated. This is for Mike, Skip rather. Skip, there's been some talk about creating a natural resource committee as either a standing committee or maybe a subgroup. Has there been any further discussion about that?
In fact, that's one of the requests that came to the board that caused us to sit down and take a look at the bylaws. We realized that to make the kind of changes we were being asked to make would take a membership vote. And one of the things we decided was that rather than have a membership vote on an individual request, such as that, to address one issue, we needed to take a look at just how rigid our committee structure was and how, in fact, the board was not able to modify membership or focus of committees in any meaningful way without violating the bylaws. So, the short answer is, yeah, there's been a lot of thought about that, and that is one of the issues that has led us to suggest this kind of structure.
Great, thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Igardo.
Thanks, Susanna. And I would also like to thank the board for sharing the information. And Mike, I think your presentation very understandable today. I appreciate what you did. I have a question, though. It's really for Skip. And it has to do with not the standing committee recommendations so much, but could you share with us what your subcommittee did with respect to benchmarking other organizations for this type of a model, and what benefits that you are expecting to see because of the increased flexibility of the model that's being proposed?
Sure. We took a look at bylaws, covenants of other similar communities, mostly regional communities. We looked at committee structure of a lot of the, again, regional communities around us. And frankly, that's where some of the ideas came from. There's no question that we borrowed from other similar organizations. As far as the benefit that we see, we do think that these 5 permanent standing committees have functions and operations that are so core to the operation of the organization that any real change in their focus should be brought to the attention of the membership, should be submitted to a membership vote. But the other work that goes on in gathering feedback from membership and getting input from membership into the focus of our amenities, the development of the community in general, is something that this board and future boards needs to be able to respond to in a more flexible manner than having to wait each year for the annual meeting and propose bylaws changes that would be voted on. We think that while that process needs to be open, and any changes in policies and procedures that this board or future boards would propose would certainly be transparent to the community and would be something that would have to be voted on by the board, but it still would allow the board to be more responsive to the changes that are happening around it.
Skip, thank you, and thank you for your work. It seems to be well thought out.
Jenny, I don't have any more questions. I don't have any more hand raises. Oh, wait a second. I see Chris Gallert has a question. Mr. Gallert, if you unmute yourself, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just a quick question. I mean, the questions we're able to ask today, is it just what was discussed at the meeting today, or can we go beyond that?
If you've got one that we can handle right now, we'll certainly take it. Give
Okay.
us a-
Well, I mean, just kind of as a follow-up to what Mike had said earlier, what's the latest on the number of houses that have sold through the end of May, and what were the certificate fees through May as well? Do we have that information available?
Hi, Chris. I in fact was just able to see the preliminary numbers yesterday late afternoon. Um, we are behind the plan on certificate income for this year. We were behind plan for May by approximately one property, and we were running behind already. So yeah, we were behind. We do have houses in the pipeline. We watch for that in anticipation of closings, but you can't count on it until the closings happen. So we are slightly behind for this year on our plan.
Yeah, understood. I was just, curious to see, based on the number of houses that we have sold and what that actual certificate fee was, just to get a rough sense. Are we closer to 23,000 per sale, or is it much less because there's been a lot of internal turnover with people moving within Moss Creek?
Yeah, it's less than 23,000, and so you can't just go on, oh, where they sold 6 houses and.
Yeah.
And it's internal. It's also, there are a number of different, as I spoke about earlier, there are a number of different, depending on how long you've owned your property and what the rules were then, and whether there was a refund that's guaranteed as part of the certificate fee and so forth. There's a number of different numbers you can come up with. The majority of them are 23,000. You're right, but not all.
Yeah, again, I'm kind of curious how that's running.
Yep, and so really, while we may look at the number of houses sold, I look at how much is our non-operating income, and we're behind plan for this year currently. Not hugely. I would tell you that we're about on plan total for operating and non-operating through May. But fortunately, we had banner months in January and February that padded the numbers pretty well for us going into it, where we've missed them each of the last 2 months on a monthly result.
All right, Jenny, I've got additional questions, but I don't want to hog the microphone right now. So
Okay,
if others want to ask questions first, that's fine, but I've got a few others.
Why don't Chris, so that I know you have quite a few because I've seen some you sent in ahead of time. If you would like to, like for us to answer those offline, we'd be glad to do it, because I would hate to hold this whole crowd up if you've got a whole bunch more questions.
No, it's not more. It's just I was going to be selectively asking a few of them. That's fine.
Why don't you just pick your top one more for right now?
Okay.
Give us that one.
Can we get an update on Mackey's Grill? And one of the questions that I had submitted too was just seeming to notice that the placement of the palm trees seem to be very close together and very close to the new structure.
Okay, and I think John Miller is with us, and John, this would be in your bailiwick. So will you answer Chris's question, please?
Sure, Jenny, I'd be happy to. We've had that question about the pine trees. I mean, palm trees, not to be mixed up with a pine tree, certainly. The placement of the palm trees along the front of the food truck are there to try to break up the mass of it, because it is a big box, and we met there with our landscape architect to explore ways to soften the look, and that the location of the trees and the type of trees selected and so forth are all based on the recommendation and direction of the landscape architect who designed the original site plan for us. They are relatively close together along the front, but again, that was intended as a way to soften the look of the building. We've also had a question as to the 2 trees that are placed on the water side of the deck, and questioning whether or not that's going to impede expansion of the deck. And I have in prior communications indicated that while the deck was sized based on the plan that was drawn up at the outset of this, and upon which the budget for the project is based, that if we did in fact discover that we needed additional space, the deck was built so that we could expand it. But I've also indicated that a second alternative that we've always considered was a patio that would be adjacent to the deck. And when we met out there last week with the landscape architect, we discussed both of those options and decided that if we need to expand, which I think is, is quite likely, we'll go the patio approach, probably with paver patios, and the 2 trees that are located on the water side of the deck would be worked into that pattern, so they won't be in the way. Chris, does that answer your question on that?
Yeah, I also was curious about the timing of when it would be able to reopen.
Okay, happy to touch on that too. We still have a few exterior improvements that we need to finish before we're going to be able to open it. Probably the main one right now is to get the sidewalk paving completed. We've got a few things to finish up on the inside with communications and so forth, but by and large, we're about ready to go with that. We've got a little bit of trim work to do on the building, but we're actually within quite possibly as early as next week that we would begin with a soft opening. And if not next week, it'll be the following week. And when I say a soft opening, we're not going to send out an email 2 days in advance to the membership and say, come join us for the grand opening of the new Mackey Grill. And the reason for that is we need to ease into it too. Although we've got experienced personnel that will be operating it, it is a totally new facility, and it's much different working in a narrow trailer than it is working out of a kitchen. And we don't want to get hit the minute we open the door with a large demand. So, we'll let folks know when we do open it up, and I know word of mouth will spread fairly quickly. But again, it could be as early as probably later next week. And if not, it will be open the following week.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay,
Susanna,
now, I have Mr. Furman with a question.
Yeah, hi, Jenny. This question is for Skip, and it's sort of a follow-on to Tony's question. And you may have covered this really well, and I just missed it, Skip, so I apologize if you were going to have to repeat yourself. The idea that the permanent committees and the other committees, what will be the process? For example, the Natural Resources Committee, which has been talked about for a while, is that something that someone would need to recommend to the current board or recommend to you, or is that idea or other ideas working through the system naturally?
Well, Dave, that idea obviously was one of the ideas that stimulated this. So we don't need that to be sent to us again. We're going to try to accommodate that in our, as we make our policy recommendations to the board. But in the future, yes, ideas and concerns that people have, I think they come up pretty naturally. And we just want this board and future boards to be in a better position to respond.
Okay, so and then any new committee like that, other than a permanent committee, would be a board approved item.
Yeah, and it would be, we'll be addressing the functioning, the membership of the other committees in policies and procedures. So it'll still be a formal process, but it won't be as inflexible as something that requires a membership vote, which we only do once a year.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Payman said that he thought Mr. Gardner was trying to raise his hand for a question. Do you have a question, Mr. Gardner? Let me unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Hang on one second.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're unmuted, Mr. Gardner. Go ahead.
Okay. Just your first observation I wanted to make, and I did send an email to Jenny and Mike, I think we all recognize that the first rule in running a financial set of books is you avoid surprises. And I have worked in the past with the Miller Dodd, reserve company. And frankly, to see a doubling of the reserve requirements within a period of about 5 years is a big surprise. I would be very interested in, their take on why we were so under recommended. But that's, for another time. I do want to compliment you, Mike. You made a very good presentation on, why we are here. Every time we build something new, we establish a new reserve requirement. So, that's part of the deal. But I have a new question, only because I went for gas the other day. Moss Creek does have some affiliation and some oversight of Moss Creek Village. My question is, their roads are in pretty bad shape. Do we have any financial obligation to Moss Creek Village?
Ken, this is Jenny. I'm going to ask either John Miller or I know Jay Harvey is also on this call, if which one of them would like to address that question specifically.
I can address it, Jenny.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah, no, the answer, Mr. Gardner, is we do not have any financial responsibility for the improvements in Moss Creek Village. The role that MCOA has is with regard to aesthetics, basically. The ARB, there's a certain level of ARB oversight that we have over the properties in Moss Creek Village, but no financial responsibility.
Okay, so it's just limited to the aesthetics.
That is correct.
We provide water and sewer services to the village and its tenants, but that's the extent. We provide them with the potable water and we provide them the sewage, and we charge them commercial rates for both.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are those roads public roads? Or does the village have to take care of them? Or is that a county responsibility?
The village or the association over there, the ownership of those parcels are responsible for those roads.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Jenny, if you don't mind, I want to go back to just one of the comments Mr. Gardner made, just
Sure.
to amplify his comment regarding looking at that significant increase in that time frame. I want to reiterate that's the reason that we really feel it's necessary to have a new, different set of eyes take a look at this. Everything I presented today basically goes back to a root cause issue of revenue has not increased on the non-operating side of the ledger, and yet the requirement for the reserve fund has gone up over $700,000 in that time frame. So if we hang our hat on that and say that's the driving force, that's why we need to generate more revenue, then it's critical that we go back and validate that and have another set of eyes take a look at that. And that's the reason for that being done this year. So I certainly agree with you, sir.
Thanks, Mike. Susanna, more questions?
I don't have any more questions, but I tell you what I'm going to do is, if you're not able to find the raise the hand, if you have a question and you can't find that, raise your real hand and I'll just look through the pictures and see if I see any more questions.
And thank you for bearing with us as we try this new technology. It took me a while to find the raise your hand button, so I'm in the same boat you all are. So go ahead and wave at us. Make sure you put your hand right up front.
I don't see anybody waving.
Oh, there's one. Wait a minute. George
Wait.
Cobb.
Oh, George Cobb. Okay, Mr. Cobb, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon. Number one, I would like to say that this board is a breath of fresh air. Number two, my question has to do with the $700,000 deficit. The question I get from everybody is, what does that mean to me? And I guess from a clarification standpoint, if there are no big surprises between now and September, and we keep with our same model, it looks to me like it could be somewhere between $50 to $70 per month per household for a multi-year period. Does that seem to be in line with what you're looking at?
George, I'll take that. This is Mike. If to answer your question, if you want to just do simple math and pull one lever, that number may be probably pretty appropriate, but I think we're going to be looking at multiple levers on this. My suspicion is it's not going to be that easy or cut and dried, number one. Number two, that makes the presumption that we eat the whole loaf at one time and we do everything in one fell swoop in 1 year. And as I said earlier, although it may have been something that that folks didn't pick up on, this will likely be a multi-year implementation. And by multi-year, I'm not talking about spreading it out over many, many years. I'm saying probably 2, depending on impact, maybe 3. But the recommendation that I'm hoping the Finance Committee makes in the fourth quarter of this year is what levers to pull this year, and the recommendation for what levers to pull in subsequent years, and by what amount that will close that gap.
I was making an assumption of a 2 to 3 year period
Okay.
of a $50 to $70 per month per household charge. Just seemed to be a very general average if the world didn't change much.
Yeah, I haven't calculated it out based on that, because I think the formulas, the number of levers is going to be more than that.
All I did was divide the 700,000 by 1,040 homes and divide it by 12.
Okay.
Okay, I'm done.
Mr. Vuvalides, you got an additional question?
Yeah, they're predicting, I guess this is for Mike and John, they're predicting an active hurricane season. I just want to know, are we prepared financially to absorb anything that might come about, such as we did with Hurricane Matthew?
John, you want me to take that? I can take it, or you can have it if you want.
Go ahead, Mike, and then I'll fill in if need be.
I do. Thanks. Yeah, Tony, thanks for the question. Yeah, and in fact, you're right. I've seen the same thing, Tony, that they expect an unusually active hurricane season, hopefully bypassing us in all cases. But we still have insurance in place. We are well insured. We're insured to the best of our ability. Although I will tell you that the available insurance for T to green coverage that was really quite a savior for us from the 2016 Matthew hurricane is not available at the same levels for us anymore. So we're not insured as heavily. We are insured to the best extent that's available to us. I don't have significant concerns about that. I will tell you, though, that based upon the uncertainties of COVID-19, we have, you're probably aware that we have put on hold new improvement projects such as the pickleball courts until we've got a little better look at how things shake out for this year. There's uncertainties with our operating and non-operating a little bit more than usual because of that this year. But I would tell you that we still have a plan that would have over $1 million in unrestricted cash in addition to our reserve deposits at the end of this year. So that's a reasonable cushion for us, and I'm not overly apprehensive about it at this point. John, would you like to add anything to that?
No, not unless he's got an additional question on it.
No, that's it. Great, thanks, guys.
I saw Mr. Gardner waving his hand again.
Yes, Mr. Vivalides, his insurance question reminded me of one that I was thinking of regarding the virus. Do we have business interruption insurance in our package? And if so, do we have the basis of any claims for that?
Yes, we do have business interruption coverage in our insurance package, and the question of whether the interruption that was a result of the pandemic is something that's covered is being discussed and debated in the industry, as you're probably aware.
Of course.
We're still kind of in the middle of it right now. We haven't opened that conversation with our insurance company yet, but we're aware that there's a potential for it, and we will certainly pursue that to the extent that it is an option available to us.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see anybody waving, and nobody has raised their hand, so I don't have any more questions, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your attention and your participation today. If you'd like to see these presentations again or alert friends and neighbors to watch, this meeting has been videotaped and it'll be posted on our website soon. So please continue to stay safe, care for your family, friends, and neighbors. And thanks for joining us today. Hope you all have a great evening. Bye-bye.
All right.